All right, week three of Starting Point. You may have been moved from one table to another. There may be a few less people than there were before. Maybe they decided, I don't know about this whole thing, and these people look crazy. Well, if you're still here, then you still have hope, and you're doing the right thing. So, way to go, way to show up, be committed for all 6 weeks, and keep coming. It's going to be good. This week, when we take a look at kind of the overview of the Bible, as we're taking a look at the Bible over the course of 6 weeks, kind of in a 20-minute chunk at a time, so that we can get kind of a good general overview of what it's all about. This week, we're taking a look at Exodus. And Exodus is the book of the Bible that I feel ties everything together. It is really the best link between what happens between God trying to pursue us and having his people and wanting to show the rest of the world who he is through these people, and what happens in the life of Jesus. And so Moses and Jesus are very connected in what happened in their lives. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. Okay? So last week we talked about Abraham and how God made the first move toward us through this person named Abraham. Came and said, your descendants are going to be as many as the stars in the sky. Abraham then goes on to have Isaac. Isaac then has Jacob. Jacob then has Joseph. Joseph then, through the course of some very interesting events, in fact, I believe in our video archive, we have a Joseph series. It is one of my favorites that Patrick has ever done. It is so good. And so if you're really interested in the life of Joseph, go watch that, because it's just fantastic. So Joseph is a really critical character, because Joseph, after he's sold into slavery, heads to Egypt. Well, he rises up into power. He rises up into power, and he becomes kind of the second in command to the Pharaoh. And so what happens in the midst of there is that there's a great famine in the greater Middle East. And so there aren't a lot of resources. And well, Joseph, what he does is that because he interprets this dream that the Pharaoh has, he's able to then make sure that the greater Egypt area has enough food. Well, the word spreads throughout the region, the greater region, that Egypt still has food. They still have grain. They're still surviving. They've been able to stockpile water, all of those things. And so people from surrounding lands are coming to Egypt. Well, what happens is that Joseph's 10 brothers, they come to Egypt, and they end up asking Joseph for food. They don't know who he is. And so eventually it gets revealed, and his entire family ends up moving to Egypt. Now that's important because they stay there. They stay there because they just begin to have a life there. And then what happens between Genesis chapter 50, which is the end of the life of Joseph, there's about a 250, or what's more likely is a 400-year period of silence, and that begins the book of Exodus. And I've always said that if you can understand Genesis and Exodus in the Old Testament, and the Gospel of John and the book of Romans, you can understand the rest of the Bible. I'd say those 4 books are the most critical that help tie really everything together. And so those are the really, really critical ones. If you're only allowed to draft 4 of them, those are the ones that I would read. But what happens between Genesis and Exodus? There's this 400-year period of silence, and all we know in Exodus chapter 1, it says that the Hebrew people, they just multiplied like crazy. I mean, it was like rabbits. I mean, there were kids everywhere, and they rose up, and there was such a great multitude that the Pharaoh actually became fearful of them. He became fearful of them, and he said, if these people decide to rise up, they could overthrow me. There's enough of them. If they just organized, now there was no threat of rebellion except for probably in his own mind, where he's going, listen, this could really happen. I don't want to lose my power. And all of these Hebrews, look at them. They're taking up a good portion of the population and resources. And so what he decides to do, because he had grand plans to really be the center of the planet, to be the most powerful empire on the planet. And he was working his way toward it pretty quick. But he wanted to fast forward that, because kings, when they get power, they just, it's insatiable. They just want more. And so what he does is that he enslaves all of the Hebrews. And so it is one of the most vicious acts in human history, where 600,000 people are instantly enslaved. And he uses the Hebrews to build his kingdom. And so where Moses enters into the story in chapters 1 and 2 of Exodus is that Moses was one of the children that was born during this time when the Pharaoh was saying, hey, we've got to enslave all these people, and they're a threat. And the best way to end a threat to your throne is to make sure that they can never that an army can never be raised up. And so what he did, he said, go slaughter all of the males under I think it was 4 years old, maybe it was 2 years old. And so there was this mass murder that happened by the Egyptians coming through, killing all of the male babies, throwing them into the river, and it was just awful. Well, Moses' mother, she heard about this, and so she devised a plan. Okay, I'm going to take my son, take him down the river, put it in this basket of reeds, and I'm going to float him down the river. She does that. He floats down the river, and lo and behold, one of the princesses from the palace finds Moses. And so she finds Moses. Long story short, Moses ends up being raised in the palace as an Egyptian prince. All of the other males from his generation were killed, and it was just standard that they would kill the male child so that they couldn't raise up an army and defeat the Pharaoh. But Moses is raised in the palace. He fully believes that he's Egyptian. Probably figures out a little bit later he looks a little bit different than everybody else. And over the course of time, he actually finds out that he's not Egyptian. He finds out that he's a Hebrew. And it dawns on him one day that all of these people that were enslaved were Hebrews. They were his family. And so he's just distraught about this. And one day he's out and he's looking at this kingdom of the Egyptians being built, and he sees his people, what he now identifies as his people, being mistreated. And one of them is just being horribly beaten for not keeping up his production of the brick, as the straw and mud would be, kind of packed together, and production wasn't being kept up, and so he was being beaten. Well, this really ticked Moses off. Moses was angry about this, and so he went ahead and he killed this Egyptian slave driver. And so he kills him, and he thinks that, and he takes him and he buries his body in sand, and he thinks that he gets away with it. Well, word quickly gets out that it was, because he was out the next day amongst the people again, because he's surveying kind of everything that he's doing. He's probably thinking in his head, is there anything I can do about this? And one of the people makes the comment, one of the other Egyptian slave drivers says, what are you going to do, kill me too? And that's when Moses realizes that he's a marked man and that he needs to run for his life. And so Moses, he flees in the middle of the night, and he goes and he runs 400 miles away. He gets as far away as he possibly can from Egypt, from that life, and he just realizes, you know what? I don't need this. I'm not really welcome in my own house. My whole life has been a lie. I'm not really an Egyptian. All that stuff that I had, it was only built by my own family that's enslaved. I'm powerless to do anything about it. I'm going away, and I'm just going to live my life in quiet, and I'm just going to try to forget about it. And so what he did is he ran all the way to Midian, a place called Midian, and he lived there for the next 40 years. He ends up marrying. He marries a gal named Zipporah, and they have a couple of kids. Not a whole lot is written about his wife and kids in the Bible, but we do know that he was there. And if you're going to choose a profession where you just want to get away from people and not be found, he chose it. He was a shepherd. He was a shepherd, and he got away from everything. He was even away from his family, really, most of the time. And he was out there in the midst of the sheep and watching them and doing what shepherds do. And one day, God appears to him in a burning bush. So over the course of 40 years, we know nothing of what happened in there. My guess is that it was on Moses' mind all the time, every night, because he had nothing but time to think. And if you've ever had a traumatic event happen in your life, if you've ever seen someone killed, if you've ever seen something, a lot of people that come back from war have this issue of, post-traumatic stress disorder, if you're a rape victim, whatever it might be, these traumatic things, they cannot get out of your head. You have nightmares about them for the rest of your life. They affect everything. And so my guess is over the course of those 40 years, and there's no biblical evidence of this, but my guess is that it just gnawed at Moses about what his family was going through. That he wanted to do something, that maybe God was even nudging him to do something, but he wouldn't budge. He would not budge one bit. And whenever God has a difficult time to getting through to people in normal means, he always then tries to get to them through abnormal means. Speaking through a burning bush would be a little bit abnormal. He said, I can't get the attention of Moses any other way, and so I'm going to do something that really gets his attention. Because for a shepherd, a fire, that's a major threat to your job. And so he's going to leap up right away. Whereas if he hears a voice, he's like, I'm just hearing voices again. It's kind of weird. But a fire, he really jumps up at. And he gets and it gets the attention of Moses. He goes over, he goes to the bush, and God says to him, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. And then he proceeds to tell him, Moses, you are going to be the one that goes to let my people go, because I've heard the cries of my people. They have been oppressed, they've been enslaved, and now I'm going to use you to go back to Egypt and free my people. And Moses says, you've got the wrong guy. I am not the guy for this job. I'm not. Look at me. I'm old. I don't speak very well. How am I really going to do this? There's no way. And God says, no, you're the guy. And so, long story short, he goes back to Egypt. He appears to the Pharaoh, and he says, let my people go. And the Pharaoh laughs at him, and he says, are you kidding me? And you want me to give up my entire labor force that's building my empire just because you said that God says to let your people go? Are you crazy? And then Moses says, okay, let my people go or else. And that the or else part were the 10 plagues. And that's when God released 10 plagues upon Israel. A lot of them were a lot of them were kind of disgusting. Other ones were quite funny. There was the plague of the frogs. There were the gnats, there were the flies, there were the boils on people's skin and the animals. There are all of these different plagues, the river turning to blood, and all of these signs. Every single one, the Pharaoh would oftentimes say, okay, the people can go, but then he would change his mind and say, no, the people can't go. And so finally, Moses says, you've got one last chance. If you don't do this, God's going to do something very, very destructive. And what that very destructive thing was, this is the thing that connects the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jesus as well as this event that I'm about to describe, the 10th plague. The 10th plague was something called the angel of death. And with the angel of death, what that plague was, that it was going to cross through the land of Egypt, and it was going to kill all of the children, all of the firstborn children that were in the land, unless you followed God's instructions. God's instructions were to take a lamb into each household, and you're supposed to raise this lamb, and you're supposed to care for it, and you're supposed to become emotionally attached to this lamb so that you care for it over the course of a number of weeks. And then after that number of weeks, you're supposed to sacrifice the lamb. And the reason you're supposed to care for it and then sacrifice it is that it's supposed to hurt a little bit. It's supposed to kind of reflect that, hey, this is the type of sacrifice that I'm talking. It's not a sacrifice if you're not emotionally attached to something. And that's why God says later in the Bible, I'm not just after meaningless sacrifice, I'm after mercy. God's really after our hearts. He's not just after kind of these religious movements, this kind of song and dance that sometimes we think that appeases God. And so you care for this lamb, you slaughter it, and you take some of its blood, and then you paint it over the doorpost of your home. And so on a certain night that they had predetermined, all of the Israelites, they painted the blood of the lamb over the doorposts. And so when the angel of death came by that night, the angel of death would see the blood, and the angel would pass over or pass by that house. That is why one of the most holy weeks, probably the second most holy week in the Jewish calendar, is Passover, because the angel of death passed over. It's the celebration of how God used this incredible miracle to save the Hebrew people, to save the Israelites, by the angel of death passing over them. Passover week also coincides with the Christian week of Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection, where essentially the blood of Jesus was painted over us, and because of that, the angel of death passes over us. Does that make sense? So that's the connection between this event in Exodus as well as what happens in the life of Jesus in that last week where he dies on the cross and blood is shed. And so that was the standard that God had back then and the process that he put in place, and it was the same for this final once and for all sacrifice that Jesus had for our lives as well, that was meant for the entire world, not just for the Jewish nation, not just for the Israelite people. So what happens from that point? To sum up the rest of Exodus, there's a lot of important things that happen. The 10 Commandments are given. Moses, he leads the people across the Red Sea. They wander into the Sinai Desert. They camp at Mount Sinai for quite a while. Moses goes up and down the mountain a number of times to talk to God. And the people rebel. They say they complain. They want to go back to Egypt. But eventually they march on because they have been promised that they were going to come into a land that was flowing with milk and honey. They called it the Promised Land. And so they finally make their way to the edge of the Promised Land after a lot of years. And Moses actually doesn't get to go into the Promised Land because he was disobedient at one point. But his successor, Joshua, does. And so for the rest of the book of Exodus, they make their way, they rebel, they make their way to the edge of the Promised Land, and they finally go into the Promised Land with Joshua. And then the story from there, it really takes kind of an interesting turn as it moves towards the rest of the history, is that they then go and they conquer a lot of territory. They conquer a lot of territory, and then they kind of land in what is now kind of modern-day Israel. And life is pretty good. Life's pretty good. Things are growing. They're taking over land. They're able to settle in, and they get kind of a little bit lazy because they've been given a lot, and there's no longer that dependency on God that oftentimes keeps our relationship fresh with God. One of the reasons why he allows tensions in our lives is so that we can reach out to him, right? Well, a lot of that tension had kind of disappeared, and people were kind of settling back into life where they were just interested in kind of getting their own thing. And so that's the short of it on the story of Exodus, which ties all things together. It's the link between Genesis leads up to Exodus, and then Exodus really leads into the history of what happened to the nation of Israel and all of its struggles and all of its kings. And we'll get into that next week in week number 4 as we look at the history, and we're going to look at the prophets and some of the prophecy that was foretold about Jesus that really becomes the link between discovering what God's intention was and what his plan was, not just to redeem Israel, but now God's going to be up to a bigger plan of redeeming the entire world and really showing himself to the world. So that's what we've got. I know that that you are going to launch into some discussion time right now as well. And so thank you, and we will be back for week number 4.